Our theme this month is roots. Roots that ground us, support us, give us strength, and connect us to the earth and all else that is interconnected. Now, some of you my age or older may have thought we'd be talking about Roots, the groundbreaking 1977 miniseries based on Alex Haley's novel. I watched every minute of that on my family's color Motorola. That was binge watching before there was binge watching. But no, today we're talking about what our theological and spiritual roots are and what keeps us grounded, especially during disruptive times and navigating tensions to find a balance in our lives. Between the preface and first song in our gray hymnal, you'll find the Unitarian Universalist principles and sources. The seventh principle references respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Reverend Colin emphasized the importance of connections last week when he told us that in the liberal theological tradition of which we are a part, God is understood to be the experience of connection to something greater than ourselves. He then offered up some strategies and spiritual practices to help us foster a sense of connection. He then went on to describe German theologian Martin Buber's 3 ways we might encounter this experience, this connection. Through nature, through other beings, people and animals, and through art. We talked about this experience with nature at Pub Theology Thursday night. A feeling of real connection was described by nearly everyone there as they described their walks on the beach or lying on their backs, letting the sky full of stars envelop them. Of course, by nearly everyone, I mean 4 people. I scheduled Pub Theology at the same time as the Astros playoff game, in my great and unmatched wisdom. We also talked about art, and perhaps even more than evocative paintings or sculpture, how music can both transport and connect us. I've confessed this to other congregations and sermons, so I might as well tell you now. It will tell you a lot about who I am. In seminary, when class discussions led other students to quote Bible verses and wax poetic on theology, I would almost always be reminded of lyrics to Broadway show tunes. Like I told you in my last sermon, I majored in art and minored in theater. So perhaps even more than the gazillion religious paintings I studied in art history class, when I think of art, the Broadway show Sunday in the Park with George springs to mind. In it, a fictionalized and musicalized version of French pointillist painter Georges Seurat tells us of some of the elements an artist uses to compose a piece of art. He describes his task: white, a blank page or canvas. The challenge: bring order to the whole through design, competition, tension, balance, light, and harmony. Well, it occurred to me I could probably preach an entire sermon on those 6 things. I'm going to focus this morning on tension and balance and how those things interplay with our roots, our connections, and our relationships. I'm going to talk about how our historical and theological ancestors navigated various problems of tension and balance, then talked about the tension, balance, and connections in our lives today. So first, we're going to take a look at some of the roots of our faith tradition. As we heard in our readings, our theological ancestors not only sought to embrace a mystery that resonated with their emotions, but also have a faith that made sense to them. It's a difficult tension and balancing act worthy of Cirque du Soleil. Well, to be honest, UUs come by our tightrope act honestly. Back in the newly founded United States, the Unitarians and the Universalists, while alike in their ability to openly and loudly question long-standing Christian doctrines, were very different from one another in culture and temperament. If you'll allow me to overgeneralize with a broad brush, the Unitarians were the well-heeled, educated, and wealthy Boston Brahmin, and the Universalists were their country cousins. The Universalists in Western New England were skeptical of educated ministers and read the Bible for themselves and cherished debates with neighbors who read it differently. The associate minister in Dallas, my friend Aaron White, describes the union of the Unitarians and Universalists in 1961 as being akin to Willie Nelson marrying Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And even before that unlikely marriage of our denominational forebears, our theological ancestors found themselves having to hold very different things in tension and figuring out how to balance and navigate the two. In our readings, we learned about two types of our theological ancestors. Our second reading was excerpts from the chapter introductions to a collection of readings focusing on the 6 sources from which our living tradition is drawn. The page I referred to earlier in the gray hymnal also lists our sources. The first source is direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder, affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. And our fifth source is humanist teachings which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science and warn us against idolatries of the mind and spirit. So this points to the challenge of accepting mystery and wonder in our lives while hoping to overlay a framework of logic, not an easy balance. As Kathleen Rollins wrote, direct experience has always been critical to the Unitarian Universalist understanding of religion. It has led us to become and to affirm heretics, those who courageously stand up to orthodoxy because they trust their own experience more than traditional authority. Then later, referring to the fifth source, she writes, we take joy with others in the life of the mind and the tests of reason applied to philosophical and theological claims. We celebrate our ever-expanding knowledge of the mysteries of life through the sciences and the arts. Our theological ancestors embrace of both unorthodox ways of experiencing the divine mystery and their demand for a faith that made sense to them is a tension felt even today. We deeply feel emotions as we experience that transcending mystery and wonder for ourselves. We enjoy pondering the difficult questions and discussing the newfound realizations about our world and beyond with others in our community. In today's hectic world, there are various things we have to try to balance, and various ways we seek to create a sense of balance in our lives. Work-life balance immediately springs to mind. It is a concern for most people, especially parents of young children. Work-life balance is defined as the lack of opposition between work and other life roles. It is the state of equilibrium in which demands of personal life, professional life, and family life are equal. Demands meet us coming and going, and there never seem to be quite enough hours to get everything we'd like to accomplished. But we need to pause and remember what philosopher Dolly Parton once told us. Never get so busy making a living that you forget to make a life. And these days, we know we're pressured to be more than just busy. We must also be productive. Americans seem to be under never-ending and ever-increasing pressure to be more productive. Even my 91-year-old father-in-law who retired from being a county attorney in West Texas just 3 years ago, bemoans the fact that he doesn't feel productive anymore. I want to say, dude, chill. Kick back. You've earned it. Before coming here, I was a hospital chaplain. One of the conundrums of chaplaincy as a profession is proving to the bean counters that our services are worthwhile, especially since chaplains don't produce any revenue. There doesn't seem to be any question in the patient's minds that what we're doing is worthwhile, but chaplains are somehow supposed to show that we're being productive. Our job is to minister to people who are going through devastating circumstances. How one would quantify that, I'm not quite sure. But mid-level managers did have ideas about how many patients a day we should be able to visit. But I would debate all day about if I'm being more productive by spending 5 hours seeing a dozen patients who are not upset over their minor surgery, or spend it consoling the family of one teenage patient who was clinging to life after a horrible accident. They both take the same amount of time, but how do you quantify that? And why should you have to? Theologian and prolific writer Thomas Merton wrote, "We are so obsessed with doing that we have no time and no imagination left for being. As a result, people are valued not for what they are, but for what they do or what they have, for their usefulness." But this morning, I'm not interested in quantifying how much we produce, but instead in navigating the tensions in our lives to find a balance so we can make meaningful connections. I'm not interested in what we do in order to produce more, but what we do in order to help produce the beloved community here on earth. In our busy lives, how do we find the balance? Well, I'm not going to be able to answer that question for you. One of the things I realized that allowed me to give myself permission to be a minister was that often I won't have answers. My job is to help you ask better questions. So sad to say, I'm not going to be much help with negotiating this tension between our need to put food on the table and our need to spend time around that table with our families, except to repeat the axiom. No one on his deathbed ever said, "I wish I had spent more time at the office." Instead, let's focus on that time away from work, what we're doing while we're making a life. Specifically, how do we stay grounded while tending to our families, helping others, standing up for justice, and attending to our spiritual lives? There are tensions even there, perhaps especially there, demands on our time, and again, there never seem to be quite enough hours to get everything we'd like to accomplished. For several years, I've wondered about holding the tension between having a calm, deeply resonant spiritual life and still responsibly addressing the wildly alarming social justice issues in our communities and country. How do people do it? You heard how Julia Butterfly Hill did it. Thomas Merton, whom I quoted earlier, was both a Trappist monk and influential social activist. How can I work toward achieving the legendary balance he demonstrated? UU churches are full of people doing yoga in one room and painting protest signs in another room right down the hall. We read Mary Oliver and Thich Nhat Hanh on the same laptop that we compose our vehement letters to the editor. Letters railing against structures that uphold oppressive systems in our society. And to stand up to those systems and structures that tell us what we should be thinking, feeling, and doing takes real courage. Brains, heart, and courage, just like the travelers down the yellow brick road in Oz. Speaking of Friends of Dorothy, this week we celebrate National Coming Out Day. National Coming Out Day is described as an annual lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered LGBT Awareness Day observed on October 11th. The idea behind it is that homophobia thrives in an atmosphere of silence and ignorance, and that once people know that they have loved ones who are LGBT, they are far less likely to maintain homophobic or oppressive views. I don't bring this up to announce that I'm gay. You just heard me talk about my love of show tunes. But I do bring it up for a couple of other reasons. One, perhaps surprising to many, job discrimination against gay and transgender workers is still legal in much of the United States. Just this past week, the Supreme Court heard arguments regarding this. According to the New York Times, if the court decides that the law, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, applies to many millions of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender employees across the nation, they would gain basic protections that other groups have long taken for granted. Let me say that again. They would gain basic protections that other groups have long taken for granted. Some of us thought that winning marriage equality ended the fight, but it continues. But mostly I bring this up because it does fit in with both our theme and our topic. And it allows me to make the shift from what are our roots, historically and theologically, to what gives us roots and keeps us grounded. As Colin talked about last week, what gives us the grounding to face and explore that which is greater than ourselves and stand up for what we know in our hearts is right. In my last sermon, I talked about how realizing I was gay disrupted my thinking so that I could think about things in a new way, casting aside some assumptions and attitudes that didn't allow my thinking to go much out of the box. Realizing that being gay was being misinterpreted and misrepresented in the Bible allowed me to question other things. But what it also eventually did was allowed me to become comfortable in my own skin so I could live in the world more authentically. The tension between who we know ourselves to be and who society expects us to be is a tension that must be faced by everyone, not just members of the LGBT community. Knowing that you are a beloved child of God just as you are, without fear and judgment, gives you the freedom to explore the mystery and the divine in our world in ways that feel right and make sense to you. And it gives you the freedom to accept others who are different without fear and judgment. So I contend that in order to, in any real way, ground yourself in the world, you must know and accept yourself for who you really are. We, here as your tribe, are here to accept you. Once those authentic connections with others begin to be made, you come to know and understand yourself more and more, and begin to grow. Once you know yourself more, you will learn how to apportion that time creating a life. How much time should you spend in prayer and meditation? How much time should you spend protesting wrongs and advocating for those without a voice? Only you know. I can't tell you. I'm here to help you ask better questions. But here's a trick that I learned. If you aren't sure, while lying on your back, gazing up into the stars, while being transported by an amazing piece of music, ask yourself, what breaks my heart? What, when I hear about it, leads me to want to work, to connect, and remedy, and heal. Find time to do those things. Create a balance. Create connections. They will give you roots. They will give you wings. Amen.